Right before we dive in, let's make this story bigger than just me and you. Tell me in the comments, what part of the world are you watching from, and what's the clock striking there? Morning, night, or somewhere in between? I want to see how far this story can reach. Now lean closer. Here's where it all begins. The Red Canyon Saloon squatted like a weathered gravestone against the crimson mesa that gave the town its name, a monument to the brutal honesty of frontier life where dreams came to die and men came to forget the weight of their failures. Evening shadows stretched long fingers across the dusty main street, and the amber light filtering through grimy windows did little to soften the harsh edges of this forgotten corner of Arizona territory. The year was 1887. And civilization here was still a fragile thing, a thin veneer over something wild and unforgiving that prowled just beneath the surface, waiting for moments like this to show its teeth. The establishment itself bore the scars of countless nights when civilization had worn thin and men had reverted to their baser natures. Bullet holes pocked the walls like smallpox scars, each one telling a story of pride, anger, or desperation that had ended in gunsmoke and blood. The bar, carved from a single massive oak that had somehow found its way to this desert wasteland, bore knife marks and burn scars that spoke of violence as casual as breathing. Above it all, a painting of a voluptuous woman in flowing robes gazed down, with eyes that had seen too much, her smile knowing and sad in equal measure. Inside the saloon, the air hung thick with tobacco smoke and the sour tang of cheap whiskey that burned going down and left men hollow coming back up. The floorboards, stained dark with decades of spilled blood and broken dreams, creaked under the weight of men who had come here to forget their failures, their losses, their sins. But tonight, forgetting would not come easy for anyone present. Tonight, the past would reach out with skeletal fingers and demand its due. Tommy Martinez stood pressed against that scarred bar, his slender frame trembling like a sapling in a windstorm that threatened to uproot everything he had ever known. At 19, he carried himself with the careful posture of someone who had learned early that the world was not kind to those who looked different, spoke different, or dared to exist in spaces where they weren't wanted. His dark hair was slicked back with nervous sweat, and his brown eyes, the color of rich earth after rain, darted between the three men who had cornered him like wolves circling wounded prey. The scent of fear rolled off him in waves, mixing with the saloon's cocktail of unwashed bodies, stale beer, and the metallic tang that always lingered in places where violence was a nightly occurrence. His hands, calloused from years of honest work, breaking horses and mending fences, gripped the edge of the bar so tightly his knuckles had gone white as bleached bone. Those same hands, which could gentle the wildest mustang with patience and kindness, now shook with the terrible knowledge that gentleness had no place in what was about to unfold. His clothing marked him as a working man, worn denim pants patched at the knees, a cotton shirt that had seen better days, boots that were functional rather than fashionable. But it was more than his appearance that made him a target. It was the way he carried himself, the deference in his posture, the stutter that made him seem weak to men who measured strength by the ability to inflict pain on others. In this place, at this moment, Tommy represented everything that these men despised about a changing world: difference, vulnerability, the possibility that their way of life was not the only way. "I said speak American, boy." The voice belonged to Jake "Bull" Morrison, a mountain of a man whose reputation for cruelty had spread across 3 counties like wildfire through dry grass. His thick hands, scarred from years of breaking horses and men with equal indifference, gripped Tommy's shirt front and lifted him until his boots barely touched the floor. The fabric strained and tore under the assault, and Tommy could feel the man's breath, reeking of rot-gut whiskey and something rotten beneath, washing over his face like a preview of hell itself. Bull stood 6'4" in his stockings, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun and arms like tree trunks that had crushed more than one man's windpipe in moments of rage. His face was a road map of violence, crossed with scars that told tales of bar fights, range wars, and the kind of casual brutality that marked certain men as fundamentally different from their fellow humans. His eyes, small and mean as a pig's, held no trace of mercy or compassion, only the cold calculation of a predator who had found something weaker than himself to torment. Or maybe you're too stupid to understand real words? Bull's voice carried the lazy confidence of a man who had never encountered meaningful resistance, never faced consequences for his actions. In his world, might made right, and anything that couldn't fight back deserved whatever happened to it. His philosophy was simple and brutal. The strong took what they wanted, and the weak existed only to serve or to be crushed underfoot. The man's very presence seemed to suck the light from the room, creating a vortex of malevolence that drew all attention to itself. His reputation preceded him into every saloon, every town, every gathering of men who lived by violence. Stories were told in whispers of his cruelty, of men beaten senseless for imagined slights, of families driven from their homes for the crime of being different, of a trail of broken bodies that stretched from here to the Mexican border. Tommy's mouth opened and closed, but the words that tried to emerge tangled themselves in his throat like barbed wire wrapped around his vocal cords. The stutter that had plagued him since childhood always grew worse when fear took hold, and fear now coursed through his veins like liquid fire, burning away his ability to speak, to think, to do anything but endure. The condition had made him a target his entire life. Teachers who thought he was slow, employers who questioned his intelligence, and bullies who saw his struggles as proof of weakness. "Please, senor," he finally managed, the words barely a whisper carried on breath that came in short, panicked gasps. I don't want no trouble." Even as he spoke, Tommy could hear his father's voice echoing in his memory. Proud words about standing tall, about never letting another man walk over you, about the dignity that came from honest work and honest living. But dignity seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford when faced with three men who looked at him like he was something to be scraped off their boots. His father had been a proud man, a vaquero who had worked the great ranches before the Anglos came and changed everything. He had taught his son to take pride in their heritage, their language, their traditions. But he had died before he could teach Tommy how to defend those things against men like Bull Morrison. The stutter had begun after his father's death, when 8-year-old Tommy had tried to explain to his mother what had happened at the ranch where his father worked. The words had twisted in his throat then, just as they did now, as if his very voice betrayed him when he needed it most. Over the years, he had learned to work around it, to find jobs where speaking wasn't required, to exist on the margins of a society that judged a man's worth by his ability to command respect through words or violence. Bull's companions, two lean, mean-eyed ranch hands named Cully and Pete, laughed with the cruel delight of men who had found something weaker than themselves to torment. They were cut from the same cloth as their leader, shaped by a frontier that rewarded violence and punished compassion. Cully, thin as a whip and twice as vicious, had dead shark eyes that never seemed to blink. His face was narrow and sharp like a blade designed for cutting, and his smile revealed teeth that had been broken in fights and never properly set. Pete, built like a scarecrow but with hands quick as striking snakes, grinned with teeth yellowed by tobacco and neglect. These were not men who had fallen into violence by accident or circumstance. They had chosen it, embraced it, made it their religion and their livelihood. They worked for whoever would pay them to hurt people, and they took a craftsman's pride in their ability to inflict maximum suffering with minimum effort. In another time, another place, they might have been soldiers or lawmen. Here, in this lawless territory where strength was the only currency that mattered, they were simply predators feeding on whatever prey wandered into their territory. "Senor?" Bull's voice dripped with mockery, each syllable loaded with years of accumulated hatred and ignorance. "You hear that, boys? This little greaser thinks we're in Mexico." He shook Tommy like a rag doll, and the boy's teeth chattered from the violence of it, his head snapping back and forth with enough force to rattle his brain inside his skull. "This here's American soil, and American men don't take lip from the likes of you." The casual racism rolled off Bull's tongue like water off a duck's back. To him, Tommy wasn't a fellow human being struggling to make an honest living in a hard world. He was something less, something other, something that existed to be used and discarded at will. The fact that Tommy's family had been in this territory longer than most of the white settlers was irrelevant. The fact that he worked harder than any 3 men and sent half his wages home to support his widowed mother meant nothing. The other patrons in the saloon had gone silent, their conversations dying like candle flames in a sudden wind. Some stared into their drinks, as if the amber liquid might transport them anywhere but here. Others watched with the morbid fascination of spectators at a hanging. This was the democracy of frontier justice. Everyone was equal in their powerlessness to stop what was happening, equal in their complicity through inaction. The silence was heavy with unspoken guilt, with the knowledge that good men doing nothing was all evil needed to triumph. Among the watchers sat men who had families of their own, who had sons Tommy's age working honest jobs and trying to make their way in an unforgiving world. They sat there nursing their drinks and their cowardice, telling themselves that it wasn't their business, that getting involved would only make things worse. Some of them had been victims themselves, had felt the sting of humiliation and the bitter taste of helplessness. But instead of making them more sympathetic to Tommy's plight, their own experiences had taught them to be grateful that someone else was bearing the brunt of the wolves' attention. The bartender, a grizzled man named Murphy who had seen this scene play out countless times in his 40 years behind various bars across the territory, slowly reached under the bar for the shotgun he kept there. His weathered hands trembled slightly as they closed around the familiar weight of the weapon, though whether he intended to stop the violence or join it remained unclear even to himself. Murphy had learned long ago that survival in places like this meant picking your battles carefully, and 3-to-1 odds against men like Bull Morrison were not odds that a sensible man would take. At a corner table, 2 traveling merchants clutched their sample cases and wished they had chosen a different saloon, a different town, a different profession entirely. Near the stairs leading to the rooms above, a painted woman in a faded blue dress watched with eyes that had seen too much suffering to be shocked by this latest display of human cruelty. She had learned to become invisible during moments like these, to fade into the background like wallpaper until the storm passed. In the darkest corner of the saloon, where shadows gathered like old secrets waiting to be whispered, Ezra McKinnon sat motionless as carved stone. At 64, his face bore the weathered lines of a man who had seen too much and survived more than he deserved. Each line told a story. The crow's feet from squinting into 1,000 sunrises while tracking wanted men across endless deserts, the deep furrows between his eyes from nights spent staring into campfires and wondering if tomorrow would bring his death, the parentheses around his mouth carved by years of keeping his thoughts to himself because words, once spoken, could never be taken back. His hair, once black as a moonless night and thick as a horse's mane, had gone silver white, but his eyes, pale blue as winter ice on a mountain lake, remained sharp as the day he'd first strapped on a gun belt at the age of 16. Those eyes had seen the elephant, as men said of those who had witnessed the worst humanity had to offer and lived to tell about it. They had watched towns burn, and good men die and evil men prosper, and through it all, they had remained steady, calculating, missing nothing. The hands that now held a small leather Bible were the same ones that had drawn faster than thought, that had ended 17 men's lives in fair fights across the frontier. They were scarred and calloused, marked by rope burns from countless hours spent breaking horses, by powder burns from gunfights, by the small cuts and scrapes that accumulated over a lifetime of violence. But they were also gentle hands, hands that had once braided his daughter's hair, that had taught his son to whittle, that had closed his wife's eyes on the worst night of his life. Those who knew the name The Preacher would have been surprised to see him here, in this den of sin and violence that seemed to be everything he had renounced. The transformation from legendary gunslinger to Bible-carrying wanderer had been complete, or so he told himself each morning when he knelt in prayer beside whatever patch of ground had served as his bed. The twin Colt .45s still rode his hips, their pearl handles worn smooth by decades of use, but the holsters remained tied down with leather thongs, a visible symbol of his vow never to draw them again, never to let the devil that lived in his gun hand taste blood again. The coffee in his cup had gone cold an hour ago, but Ezra continued to hold it, finding comfort in the familiar weight and warmth that reminded him of countless nights around campfires, of quiet mornings in peaceful towns, of the simple human rituals that connected all men regardless of their past sins. The cup itself was cheap porcelain, thin-walled and fragile, the kind of vessel that spoke to the temporary nature of most frontier establishments. It bore a hairline crack that ran from rim to base, a flaw that made it beautiful in its imperfection. Between his weathered fingers, a small leather Bible lay open to the book of Matthew, the pages yellowed with age and soft with handling. The words, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God," were underlined in fading ink, a reminder of the path he had chosen after his world collapsed in blood and tears. Though his attention had long since drifted from the sacred words to the ugly scene unfolding before him, the book remained a talisman, an anchor to the man he was trying to become rather than the man he had been. The Bible had been a gift from his wife Sarah on the day he promised to give up violence forever. She had inscribed it with a simple message: "For Ezra, who is learning that the strongest man is the one who chooses peace." Those words had sustained him through 15 years of wandering, 15 years of fighting the urge to solve problems with bullets, 15 years of trying to believe that redemption was possible for a man with blood on his hands. He watched Tommy's humiliation with the detached interest of a man who had learned to insulate his heart against the world's cruelties. This was not his fight. The boy was nothing to him, just another drifter passing through, another soul in need of saving that Ezra was no longer equipped to help. He had buried that part of himself 15 years ago, along with his son, in a grave that still haunted his dreams. Billy. The name rose unbidden in his mind, like a ghost materializing from morning mist, bringing with it the familiar ache that had never fully healed despite years of prayer and penance. 8 years old, with his mother's gentle eyes and his father's stubborn pride, with a laugh that could light up the darkest room and a spirit that refused to be broken by a world that seemed determined to crush anything pure and innocent. Dead because Ezra had taught him that backing down was for cowards, that a McKinnon never let another man shame him, that sometimes a man had to fight to prove he was worthy of respect. The irony was as bitter as the cold coffee. In trying to make his son strong, Ezra had made him vulnerable. In teaching him never to walk away from a fight, he had sent him to his death at the hands of another boy who had been taught the same brutal lesson. The schoolyard confrontation that had taken Billy's life had lasted less than a minute. A push, harsh words, a rock thrown with the careless strength of childhood that had found its mark with devastating precision. And Ezra had arrived just in time to hold his son's broken body and understand that all his reputation, all his skill with a gun, all his hard-won respect meant nothing when measured against the weight of a child's cooling flesh. The funeral had been held on a gray October morning when the sky wept cold tears that matched Ezra's own. Sarah had stood beside the small grave like a statue carved from ice, her face empty of everything except the terrible knowledge that the man she had married was responsible for their son's death. She had not spoken to him that day, had not looked at him, had not acknowledged his existence except to tell him that she was leaving and that he was never to follow her. That night, alone in the house that had once echoed with Billy's laughter, Ezra had made his choice. He had taken his guns and ridden out to the desert, intending to end his life where no one would find his body. But something had stopped him. Perhaps the memory of Billy's voice saying his prayers, perhaps the weight of Sarah's Bible in his saddlebags, perhaps simply the cowardice of a man who could face any enemy except his own conscience. "Maybe we should teach you some manners," Bull was saying, his voice rising with alcohol-fueled bravado that masked a deeper cruelty, a need to hurt that went beyond simple entertainment. "Help you understand how things work in civilized company." The word civilized coming from Bull's lips was obscene, a perversion of language that made Ezra's jaw clench involuntarily. There was nothing civilized about three grown men terrorizing a boy who had done nothing more than exist in their presence. There was nothing civilized about the way they savored his fear, the way they fed off his helplessness, like vultures picking at carrion. If this was civilization, then perhaps the wild animals of the desert had more honor than the men who claimed to have tamed it. Bull's face was flushed with drink and the excitement of having found prey that couldn't fight back. His pupils were dilated, his breathing shallow and quick, all the signs of a man working himself up to do violence. Ezra had seen it countless times before, in men who used their fists to settle arguments they couldn't win with words, in bullies who needed to hurt others to feel powerful themselves. It was always the same pattern. The escalating taunts, the physical intimidation, the moment when talking stopped and blood started to flow. Tommy's eyes found Ezra's across the smoky room, and in that moment the old gunslinger saw something that made his chest tighten like a fist closing around his heart. It was the same look Billy had given him in those final moments, a desperate plea for protection, for someone stronger to step in and make the world safe again, for a father figure to prove that good men still existed and would stand against evil when it showed its face. The recognition hit Ezra like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs and sending shock waves through his carefully constructed walls of indifference. For 15 years, he had told himself that his fighting days were over, that violence only begat more violence, that the path of peace was the only road to redemption. But looking into Tommy's terrified eyes, he saw every innocent victim he had failed to protect, every cry for help he had ignored in his quest to become a better man. Ezra's hand tightened on his coffee cup, his knuckles going white with the strain. The porcelain was cheap and thin, and he could feel it beginning to crack under the pressure. Tiny stress fractures spreading like spider webs through the glaze. Like everything else in this godforsaken place, it was fragile, temporary, destined to break under the weight of too much pressure, too much pain, too much human frailty pressed into service. The cracks in the cup seemed to mirror the fractures in his own carefully constructed facade of peaceful resignation. For 15 years, he had built walls around his heart, layer upon layer of prayer and penance and good intentions designed to keep the gunfighter buried and forgotten. But those walls were crumbling now, eroded by the sight of innocence under attack and the terrible knowledge that he had the power to stop it, but had chosen not to act. Bull drew back his massive fist, muscles bunching under his shirt like pythons preparing to strike, and Tommy flinched, pressing himself against the bar as if he could somehow disappear into the scarred wood, become one with the furniture and escape the nightmare that was about to unfold. The boy's terror was palpable, rolling off him in waves that made the air itself seem thick and hard to breathe. The other patrons held their breath, some from anticipation, the dark thrill that came from watching violence without participating in it, others from shame at their own inaction, their own cowardice in the face of obvious injustice. This was how it always went in places like this. The strong preyed on the weak, and everyone else looked away, told themselves it wasn't their business, that getting involved would only make things worse. But Ezra McKinnon could not look away. Not anymore. Not when those brown eyes held so much of his lost son, so much of the innocence he had failed to protect all those years ago. The careful walls he had built around his heart crumbled like sandcastles before an incoming tide, and for the first time in 15 years, he felt the old fire stirring in his veins, not the cold rage of the gunfighter, but something deeper and more righteous, the fury of a father who had failed once and refused to fail again. The coffee cup shattered in his grip. The sound was sharp and sudden in the tense silence, like a gunshot in a cathedral, like thunder splitting a clear sky, like the crack of destiny changing course. Porcelain fragments scattered across the rough wooden table, some falling to the floor with tiny musical notes that seemed to echo in the sudden stillness. Every head in the saloon turned toward the dark corner where the legendary preacher sat, his pale eyes now burning with an intensity that made hardened men take a step back and reconsider their positions in the cosmic order of things. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. The mild-mannered Bible reader was gone, replaced by something altogether more dangerous, a man who had stared death in the face so many times they had become old friends, a man who had carved his name in frontier history with lead and gunpowder and the kind of cold precision that separated legends from pretenders. The very air around him seemed to thicken and charge, like the moment before lightning strikes. Coffee dripped from his hand, dark as blood in the lamplight, but he paid it no attention. His focus was entirely on the scene before him, on the choice that lay ahead of him, on the terrible knowledge that whatever happened next would define not just this moment, but the rest of his life. The broken cup lay in ruins on the table, its fragments catching the light like tears, and in those shattered pieces Ezra saw a reflection of his own fractured soul, broken, but perhaps not beyond repair. Slowly, deliberately, Ezra set the broken pieces of the cup on the table before him, arranging them with the same careful attention he had once paid to cleaning his guns. His movements were fluid, controlled, like a cat preparing to spring, like a snake coiling to strike, like a man who had made peace with violence and found it wanting but was prepared to embrace it one more time if necessary. When he stood, it was with the quiet grace of a man who had faced death more times than he cared to count and had yet to lose the final confrontation. His full height was not impressive by frontier standards, perhaps 5'10" in his boots, but there was something in his bearing that made him seem larger, more substantial, as if he carried the weight of all the men he had killed and all the justice he had dispensed. The floorboards groaned under his boots as he stepped into the lamplight, each footfall deliberate and measured, carrying him forward into a confrontation he had spent 15 years trying to avoid. For the first time in 15 years, Ezra McKinnon let the world see the gunslinger he had tried so hard to bury beneath layers of prayer and penance and good intentions. The mask of the peaceful preacher fell away like discarded clothing, revealing something harder, colder, infinitely more dangerous beneath. This was the man who had once cleaned out an entire saloon of wanted men single-handedly, who had tracked killers across 1,000 miles of desert and brought them to justice at the end of a gun barrel, who had earned his reputation one carefully placed bullet at a time. The lamplight caught the silver threads in his hair and turned them into a crown of fire. His eyes, those pale blue eyes that had seen too much, now burned with an inner light that spoke of righteous anger held too long in check. The leather of his gun belt creaked as he moved, a sound that had been the last thing many men heard in this world, but the guns remained holstered, tied down with leather thongs that served as both symbol and restraint. Bull Morrison's face went the color of old bone, all the blood draining from his features as recognition dawned like a terrible sunrise. His grip on Tommy loosened, and the boy slumped against the bar, gasping for breath, like a drowning man who had suddenly found the surface. The big man's hands, which had seemed so powerful and intimidating moments before, now trembled like leaves in a high wind. "Sweet Jesus," Bull whispered, his voice cracking like a boy's on the verge of manhood, like a man confronting his own mortality for the first time. "That's the preacher." The words hung in the air like incense in a chapel, heavy with import and the weight of accumulated legend. Every man in that room knew the stories, some true, some embellished, all testament to the fact that Ezra McKinnon was not a man to be trifled with. They had heard about the shootout in Tombstone, where he had faced down 3 men simultaneously and walked away without a scratch. They knew about the time he had tracked the Dalton gang across 3 states and brought them in draped over their saddles. They had whispered about his speed, his accuracy, his cold-blooded ability to do what needed doing without flinching or hesitation. Cully and Pete stepped back instinctively, their predatory confidence evaporating like morning dew under a desert sun. These were men who lived by violence, who understood its rhythms and its language better than most. And they recognized something in Ezra's bearing that spoke of death walking among them. Their hands moved away from their weapons, not in surrender but in the recognition that their guns would be useless against a man of Ezra's caliber. The other patrons seemed to shrink into themselves, becoming smaller, more insignificant, as if they could somehow avoid notice by reducing their very presence in the world. The bartender's hand froze on his shotgun, suddenly aware that he was in the presence of something far more dangerous than the everyday violence he was accustomed to managing. Even the painted woman on the stairs held her breath, her eyes wide with the knowledge that she was witnessing history in the making. The silence that followed was absolute, profound, the kind of quiet that comes when the entire world holds its breath and waits to see which way fate will turn. Even the wind outside seemed to pause in its eternal dance across the desert, as if nature itself was waiting to witness what would happen next. The ticking of the old clock above the bar sounded like hammer blows in the stillness, marking off seconds that felt like hours, each tick bringing them closer to a moment that would define everything that came after. Ezra's hand hung loose at his side, inches from the pearl grip of his Colt, and every man in that room knew they were witnessing a moment that would be talked about for years to come, if anyone lived to tell it. The gunslinger's fingers were relaxed, but ready, positioned with the unconscious precision of decades of practice. His thumb rested against his hip, ready to sweep back and clear the holster. His weight was balanced on the balls of his feet, ready to move in any direction the situation demanded. The very air seemed to thicken and charge, like the moment before lightning strikes, like the pause between the flash and the thunder. Men who had lived their entire lives on the frontier, who had seen violence in all its forms, recognized that they were in the presence of something elemental, something that transcended the everyday brutality of their world. This was not just another barroom brawl or drunken confrontation. This was a reckoning, a moment when the scales of justice would be balanced one way or another. Tommy remained pressed against the bar, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and hope. He had heard the stories, too, whispered tales of the legendary Gunslinger who had become a preacher, who had walked away from violence to find a different path. But looking at Ezra now, seeing the transformation that had come over the man, Tommy wondered if redemption was possible or if some men were destined to remain what they had always been. Tommy's terrified gaze met Ezra's across the suddenly cavernous space of the saloon, and in those brown eyes, the old gunslinger saw his son's face one more time. Not as Billy had been in death, broken and still, but as he had lived, bright, hopeful, trusting in his father's ability to make everything right. The weight of that trust, carried across 15 years of guilt and regret, settled on Ezra's shoulders like a mantle of responsibility he could no longer avoid. The choice hung before him like a loaded gun, break his sacred vow and become the killer he once was, or watch another innocent soul be crushed by the world's indifference. He could feel the familiar weight of the Colt at his hip, could remember the smooth action of the cylinder, the perfect balance that made it an extension of his will. One motion, fluid, practiced, instinctive, and Bull Morrison would be bleeding out on the saloon floor. His cruelty ended forever. But what then? What happened to the man he had tried to become, the peace he had tried to find, the promise he had made to his dead wife that he would never again solve problems with violence? What happened to Tommy, who would learn that might indeed made right, that the strong could impose their will on the weak whenever they chose? What happened to the fragile hope that men could be better than their basest instincts? The questions multiplied in his mind like reflections in a hall of mirrors, each one showing a different version of himself, a different possible future. He saw himself drawing his gun, saw the look of satisfaction on Tommy's face as his tormentors fell. He saw himself walking away, leaving the boy to his fate, preserving his own hard-won peace at the cost of another's suffering. He saw a third path, harder and more dangerous than either of the others, a path that led through courage rather than violence, through strength rather than death. Ezra's fingers twitched, barely a fraction of an inch, but in that small movement lay the weight of 15 years of grief, redemption, and the terrible knowledge that some sins could never be fully washed clean. The pearl handle of his Colt seemed to whisper his name, calling him back to the darkness he had fought so hard to escape, promising him the sweet simplicity of violence as a solution to all of life's complex problems. The gun was a masterpiece of the gunsmith's art, balanced and deadly, an instrument of precision that had never failed him in all the years he had carried it. The grips fit his hand like they had been carved specifically for him, which in truth they had been. The action was smooth as silk, the trigger pull exactly to his preference, the sight picture perfect and true. In his hands, it had been more than a weapon. It had been an extension of his will, a tool of justice in a world where justice was often in short supply. He could feel the old reflexes stirring, muscle memory built over decades of practice asserting itself despite years of disuse. His hand wanted to move, to draw, to end this confrontation in the most direct way possible. It would be so easy, so natural, like breathing or walking or any of the other unconscious actions that defined human existence. One moment of violence to end all the violence, one death to prevent greater suffering, one sin to wash away the stain of inaction. But the leather thongs that held his guns in their holsters served as more than mere restraint. They were a reminder of the choice he had made, the vow he had taken, the man he had tried to become. To break them now would be to break more than leather. It would be to shatter the careful work of 15 years, to throw away everything he had built on the foundation of his son's grave. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife, heavy enough to crush a man's soul. Every person present understood that they were balanced on the knife's edge of history, that whatever happened in the next few seconds would ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, affecting not just the men in this room, but the very nature of justice and mercy in a world that seemed to have forgotten the meaning of both words. Bull Morrison stood frozen, his fist still raised but no longer moving, as if he had suddenly remembered that there were consequences to actions, that the universe sometimes provided a reckoning for those who lived by cruelty. His small pig eyes darted between Ezra and the door, calculating distances and odds, trying to determine if he could reach safety before the legendary Gunslinger decided his fate. Cully and Pete had moved as far back as the confines of the saloon would allow, pressing themselves against the far wall like men trying to disappear into the very woodwork. Their weapons remained untouched, not out of wisdom, but out of the certain knowledge that any aggressive move would be met with a response that would end their lives before they could complete the action. The other patrons seemed to have forgotten how to breathe, their attention fixed on the drama unfolding before them with the intensity of men watching their own mortality played out in real time. Some prayed silently, asking whatever gods they believed in to spare them from the violence that seemed inevitable. Others simply waited, understanding that they were powerless to influence what came next, that their role was to be witnesses to whatever justice or injustice was about to unfold. Murphy, the bartender, still gripped his shotgun beneath the bar, but his hands shook so badly that the weapon would have been useless, even if he had found the courage to use it. He had seen men die in his establishment before, had mopped their blood from his floors and tried to forget their faces, but he had never been in the presence of death so perfectly embodied in a single human being. For 15 years, Ezra had told himself that his fighting days were over, that violence only begat more violence, that the path of peace was the only road to redemption. But looking into Tommy's terrified eyes, he saw every innocent victim he had failed to protect, every cry for help he had ignored in his quest to become a better man. The careful walls he had built around his heart crumbled like sand castles before an incoming tide, and for the first time in 15 years he felt the old fire stirring in his veins, not the cold rage of the gunfighter, but something deeper and more righteous, the fury of a father who had failed once and refused to fail again. The realization came to him with the force of revelation. He did not have to choose between violence and inaction. There was a third path, harder and more dangerous than either of the others, but perhaps more worthy of the man he was trying to become. It would require courage of a different sort, strength that had nothing to do with how fast he could draw a gun, wisdom that came not from experience with death, but from hard-won knowledge of life. He thought of Sarah, of the promise he had made to her in those final terrible moments before she left him forever. She had not asked him to give up his guns. She had asked him to find another way, to become a man who solved problems without creating more problems, who protected the innocent without becoming a destroyer himself. For 15 years, he had interpreted that as a call to pacifism, to withdrawal from the world's conflicts. But perhaps she had meant something different, something harder and more nuanced. Perhaps true strength lay not in the ability to kill, but in the wisdom to know when killing was necessary and when it was not. Perhaps courage was not about facing down armed men in the street, but about standing up to evil in whatever form it took, using whatever tools were available, fighting battles that could not be won with bullets. Perhaps redemption was not about running from his past, but about using the hard-earned wisdom of that past to forge a better future. And in that moment, with eternity balanced on the edge of a heartbeat, with the future hanging in the space between thought and action, the question that would define everything hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Would the preacher draw his gun one last time and damn his soul for the sake of justice? Or had he truly found another way to save the innocent, a path that led not through death, but through something far more difficult and infinitely more meaningful? The answer lay in the choices of a man who had learned that true courage wasn't about how fast you could draw a gun, but about when you chose not to draw it at all. It lay in the wisdom of a father who had lost everything that mattered and discovered that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from defeating your enemies, but from refusing to become what they are. It lay in the faith of a man who had spent 15 years trying to believe that redemption was possible, that broken things could be made whole again, that even in the darkest places, light could still find a way to shine. The saloon held its breath, waiting for the preacher's answer, waiting to see whether this night would end in blood or something else entirely. The choice was his to make, and his alone. The weight of it pressed down on him like the hand of God, demanding an answer that would echo through eternity and define not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone who witnessed what came next. In that endless moment between decision and action, Ezra McKinnon stood at the crossroads of his life, knowing that whatever choice he made would determine not just who he was, but who he would become. The guns at his side whispered their deadly promises, while the Bible in his coat pocket spoke of mercy and forgiveness and the possibility of a better way. The answer would come soon enough, carried on the wind that was already beginning to whisper through the canyon, bringing with it the scent of change and the promise that this night would end very differently than it had begun. But first, there would be a moment of perfect silence, a pause in the eternal conversation between good and evil, while one man decided which voice he would choose to follow into whatever came next.